Welcome to Slight Reliability, learning SRE one day at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability one week at a time. Today we're talking about the future of SRE and our wish list of what we'd like to see happen in 2023 and beyond. And to help me explore this topic today, I'm joined by the hosts of the On Call Me Maybe podcast, Adriana Villela, is it that correctly, and Margarita Medina. How are you?
Doing great so far. 2023 hasn't been the roughest, so we're doing pretty okay.
Yeah, and a good way to kick off our first week back at work with a podcast recording. Very awesome.
That's very cool. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background of you and your career, maybe starting with you, Anna?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a very untraditional story, and one of those kids that got a chance to find coding at the age of 13 and started banging out some HTML code and CSS and JavaScript and was like, whoa, this is really cool. Learning on Alta Vista, like that was what was around at that time. And it made me like really enjoy it. So eventually decided to become like a freelance web developer, graphic designer, and that kind of narrowed down like, oh, I can make money by doing this. So I took a few internships and they all kind of told me like, go study computer engineering, go study computer science. I was like, all right, that makes sense. I'll go to college, I'll do this. And I decided to go to college to study computer science. I went to community college in Miami, transferred out to University of California, Santa Cruz. And it kept this recurring theme of like, I know how to teach myself how to code. I know how to get code up and running, working on projects, working with other people. But the stuff that we were learning in school didn't translate to what I would actually see out there. And at the same time, I had a hard time kind of like fitting into the computer science education curriculum due to like being one of the only ones in the room, being too afraid to ask questions and things like it, that I actually eventually dropped out of school. So, when I dropped out of school, like I already had like a really beefed up resume with a whole bunch of internships, including like startups and Google and such. So I got a chance to walk into Uber as their first site reliability engineering intern. And at that moment, like I was your standard developer of like, can do full stack, but don't ask me about anything under. So walk into SRE and it's just like, do my engineering education the first week, and then I go over to my SRE team. We're like an embedded SRE organization, and it's like, all right, you're going to be secondary on call for our infrastructure rotation that manage the critical 40 services, and then the chaos engineering tooling. And I was just like, wait, what is all of this? What are servers? What are operations? So while like getting ready to go on call, I had to go learn all these things. Like there was so many amazing brains at the company that I could pick at. And I started diving into that space, and that kind of led me to just being in the SRE space since. Got a chance after Uber to work on cloud, like worked on cloud infrastructure at Uber, and then transitioned to working at a chaos engineering vendor called Gremlin, where I spent the last 4 years helping folks build out their SRE practices by thinking about failure early. And for the last 7 months, I've been at Lightstep helping folks think about reliability, but from the observability standpoint, like let's go ahead and understand our systems before we start injecting more failure into them and such. But that's a little bit about where my career kind of has taken me.
That's super cool. I really like how you found this path, which is, non-traditional. There's this whole thing, you go to uni, you do your degree, which I did, but I completely agree that what they taught at university was wildly different to what's actually happening in the industry, and only focused on development. In my case, it was basically just Java development. This is back in the ancient days, and that's all we really learned about. I had no idea about that there was a whole industry around testing, for example. What about you, Adriana?
So I started my computer journey at around age 10 and my dad like is a huge computer guy. Like he's a software architect. So I think it was inevitable that it was going to be in my blood. So at age 10, we had our 386 SX with DOS days. I think Windows 3.1. That's how old I am. And he's like, "Hey, let me show you something cool." And he showed me how to write some like simple lines of BASIC. That is how old I am. And so I was like, "Oh, this is actually kind of neat." And I dabbled in BASIC here and there, and I took some computer programming courses in high school using Visual Basic. That's, how elevated it got. But I think for university, I actually wanted to design rocket ships. I watched a lot of Star Trek growing up, and I'm like, I want to build a space shuttle. So I wanted to go to school for aerospace engineering, and I got accepted into a program at University of Toronto for that. And it lasted about a couple of weeks before I realized, oh my God, these people are like way too brainy for me. Like maybe I'll just switch to mechanical engineering. I can still pursue it this way. And then as I kept like working towards my first year, I'm like, oh, I actually like coding. And at that point, I decided I didn't want anything to do with coding, which is hilarious because like going into an engineering degree, like you really can't escape coding. Like it's part of your curriculum, no matter what specialty you're in. And after my first year, I'm like, oh, actually, it would be cool if I transferred to computer engineering. But I ended up not doing that because if I were to do that, they would have like made me redo first year because they had like quotas for all the classes. So I'm like, okay, whatever, I'll just like stick with this. I ended up transferring into industrial engineering because it had some like some comp sci type classes. Like I took a data structures and algorithms class, and I got to take a networking class. Like, so there were some computery classes that I got to take. Also got to take human factors classes. So it was like a more interesting degree that was more in line with what I wanted to do. And I knew full well that like no matter what, I knew that when I finished university, I just wanted to get a job where I was going to write code. And so I spent my first few years out of university, well, for several years, I guess, 16 years writing Java code. I was a Java developer for that long. So I definitely appreciate Steven's Java experience. That was like my bread and butter for the longest time. And then at around in 2016, I had a weird break in my career where I did decide I'm done with tech. I'm going to be a professional photographer. So I was a professional photographer for a year, realized that I hated the interactions. There were some really nasty interactions with some of my clients, and that was like enough to traumatize me. But I picked up some really good skills. I had to learn to network with people. I had to learn how to blog. I had to maintain a website. I started up a newsletter, which eventually were really good things that led me to my current job as a DevRel. But before I found myself as a DevRel, I ended up in 2016. I found DevOps and I found each other, I guess, when I was back at my tech job after seeing the light and had a really bad like release experience for pushing code into prod, and I was complaining to my dad. I'm like, there's got to be a better way than this. This sucks. And he's like, oh, you should check out DevOps. So I'm like, ooh, this DevOps thing looks awesome. So I ended up building like, this build and release pipeline for my team. And it was like love at first sight. And it led me to ending up like I ran a DevOps program at Bank of Montreal for 3 years. We like developed practices and standards around DevOps for the whole organization. And then I found myself after that, I decided to take a step back and do, I was a release engineer for 18 months. And then after that, I was at Two Cows for a bit, managing an observability and a platform team, which is how I got into observability and started, I started blogging a couple of years ago. And so like when I was learning about observability and stuff, I blogged about my experiences, and I always post my blog posts on Twitter. And then one day our now boss, Austin, messages me on Twitter. He's like, hey, cool article. How'd you like to do this for a living? And I'm like, would I? So that's how I ended up in DevRel. So very topsy-turvy. Haven't been in DevRel for that long, I guess, since May of last year, but it's been awesome. I feel like that's it's been a long time coming. I've been preparing my whole life for this role, so it's awesome.
That's super cool. Yeah, it's new to me too. It's only been since November that I've been in the DevRel space, and it's very different.
Here's to
You're talking
newbies.
about you're talking about basic. I actually just like had a flashback. I remember when I was about 12. I learned Q Basic, and I wanted to make video games. I remember making this game where it was basically I wrote the code to draw everything on the screen, and rather because I didn't know how to animate, so I just like copy and pasted the code like hundreds of times and had go-to statements between them to redraw each time. It was so terrible.
That.
I actually went back because I was thinking about like my coding stuff like maybe 2 months ago, and I went back to the book that my brother got me. I think it was like Game Programming for Teens, and this is like a year or two since I started doing websites, and it was like using one of like it was like a library built on top of Basic to teach people how to do game programming, and I was like, I technically would have learned Basic, but I guess I didn't. But like when she mentioned Basic, like my head went there too. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. It's always that weird thing where it's like having to remember all the random things that I did to get to where I was at. Like when you guys mentioned Java, I was like, oh yeah, I remember sitting in Java class and hating it, but then would just tell myself, like, especially because it was like way later in time, it was like, well, if I learn all this Java, I can go make Android applications. So that's what I started doing too. Like I was like building iOS application and Android, and I was like, this makes sense. I hate you libraries, but I can do this. So let's do this.
And Java was like, at least when I graduated university, it was like the hot new language. I mean,
Yeah.
this was to the point where like the universities were starting to teach them as part of the curriculum. I don't know what the state of it is now. I don't know. What do they teach in schools? Python?
I think it depends per every university and every city. Like I took Java in community college, and I want to say that Santa Cruz also was teaching it. I barely recall. I just remember hating Perl. Like we were getting taught Perl for some weird reason.
Oh God, I never learned Perl.
So SRE.
Yes, nice tangent, right?
It's become this growing thing in the industry. Although interestingly, I did find out going to reInvent, there was very few SREs there, but I still think it's definitely growing. It's becoming mainstream. Kyle Forster from Runwin, who's been on the show before. He posted something recently where in the world for the first time, there are more SREs outside of Google and Facebook than there are in Google and Facebook, which is cool. And obviously it's an evolving space. And I guess today we're going to talk about what's our wish list. What do we want to see improve or change in the industry to make it better for everyone? Because ultimately it's about doing better work easier and better customer experience and all that good stuff. So I'll just start with the first one. I think that I'd like to see observability be sort of acknowledged as like it's the starting point or like a compulsory part of SRE, because I see a lot of sort of SRE roles in the industry which are almost more traditional operations or infrastructure engineering with automation attached to it. But the way I see it is if you can't actually see what's happening in terms of can the customer consume the service, number one, and I've worked in plenty of organizations where you can't answer that question, then, well, what is the point in all this other automation and stuff that you're doing? So I'd like to see that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And it makes me think back to like when the DevOps movement was starting. And like I always said that DevOps would have finally attained its like nirvana once DevOps itself was just baked into software development practices. And I see the same thing for observability. Like now we have a means of gaining greater insights into our systems, or I guess we've always had it, but it's definitely evolved, and it's taken the form of observability. And I think there's like a lot of cool tools in this space that enable this, and open telemetry. So it should be baked into SRE. I mean, hands down, it shouldn't be a separate thing. It should be part of the SRE job. I think in the nirvana of SRE, like observability shouldn't even be talked about as a separate thing because it's going to be baked into SRE.
I 100% agree. And I mean, I'm also coming from a perspective of being in the space that we were selling tooling for companies that really wanted to start their SRE practice. And I think looking back on a lot of that, there were some organizations that really should have understood their systems better before they tried to understand all the incidents that they were going through and like injecting more failure. But I do see that, whereas like you kind of have to start on the ground of observability in order to then be able to say like, all right, how do we go from there? Because at the end of the day, like, how do you make something reliable if you don't know how it's doing currently? And how do you then like go a step ahead and say like, this is the goal of how reliable I want it to be? Like, you kind of need some form of information to gauge these thoughts, to gauge these motions that you want to do. But I think it like there is like this recurring theme of like something needs to be on top of making everything work, the same way that like Adriana mentioned, like DevOps, like getting put into software development lifecycle, like that was huge. I've been a huge proponent of like some SRE principles getting put more in there. Like I always would preach like chaos engineering should be like that pattern that would go through like the software development lifecycle to make sure that you're not regressing into past failure and that you're set up to continue being reliable as you go forward. But there's like a larger theme that I continue seeing, and like I saw it as like I worked in open source and such. So now that like I've been working with Adriana and like she comes from that expertise of like observability, I think one of the biggest themes that we kind of like classified it as was like we have to like honor putting observability first by codifying a lot of what we see in SRE.
Yeah, I think I had a short stint as an SRE, probably like a year and a half, wasn't even that. And I guess I was skewed because I was in an enablement team. So I wasn't in a team doing like, my job wasn't to own and operate a bunch of services, but help the teams all over the company, improve the way they were operating and how reliable they were. And another thing is that in order to improve those teams, you need to know not just the reliability of the technology, but also sort of the maturity of the team. And I think observability also helps answer that question in a way, like, the frequency of deployments or, those kinds of metrics as well are kind of a similar thing. And if you don't know the current state of things, like how frequently a team is deploying, the success rate of the deployments, I know MTTR is a bad word these days, but that kind of thing as well. If you don't have that information, then how do you know where to improve or where the pain points are as well, which is, I think observability is important for that too.
It's kind of like that idea of like understand current state of affairs, which is not always done. It's like looking at like what are the teams that are getting paged the most, like what are like understanding like your severity of your services or your infrastructure or your or like your user stories. Like where is it that the like you need to kind of like rank them in form of order, and at the same time like understand like how many outages are we having, how much are we losing, because that's like the only way to actually proactively plan out and make progress, I would say, from what I've seen with consulting with various organizations.
Speaking of observability, how well do you think that we are getting observability in the minds of developers and engineers, sort of general developers and engineers, rather than just like observability people or SRE experts?
I think we have a ways to go. Yeah, I agree that that absolutely needs to happen, but we have a ways to go in terms of convincing people to, again, bake that into their daily lives. And I guess the interesting thing about observability is that you don't just bake it into the lives of SREs, but it's got to be baked into the lives of developers and in the lives of testers as well.
And I would say though that current state of affairs says that SREs still haven't 100% put observability at the top.
That's true as well.
That like until we're able to see the reliability subject matter experts doing so in practice and in words, you're not going to see the developers trickle down and start understanding those causes and effects. And there is a chance that that might not even happen, which is why that other part of the movement needs to move on, like needs to continue on its own, of implementing good observability practices within libraries, within projects, so that a developer starting out has has a guide that tells you this is how it should be done. And I think like open telemetry can have a lot of influence in that, from the little expertise that I've been able to get in the few months that I've done working with it.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I agree. It's more than just about convincing developers that this is important. You can talk, but if you can actually set up stuff that's already there and it's easy to use, or even better, fun to use, that seems like the way to go.
I would also add to that, though, making developers more accountable for their code that goes into prod. Because if they're more accountable for the code that goes into prod, then I think they're going to have that incentive to instrument their code, because they're thinking, hey, future me wants to, know what the hell is going on if I get paged while, during an on-call shift or whatever, right? So I think making it fun for sure, but also, light a little fire under their asses and compel them with just adding that accountability. I think it's important, because yes, your SREs hopefully will be able to get to the bottom of what's going on, but wouldn't it be nice if the person who wrote the code actually is responsible for troubleshooting, fixing it?
Do you like you build it, you run it? Is that a good concept?
I think it's a good concept. I think it makes people, if done properly, I think it'll improve psychological safety, because it'll be a better incentive for people to build better code. Like, it's not going to be perfect, but at least if they build better code, if they're incentivized to build better code, then it's going to be less traumatic when they're on call. And hopefully they won't get paged in the middle of the night. And if they do, it's not going to be this traumatic experience either, right?
And I also agree with it too, because it's if like we're not believing that, you're almost setting up again for dev, like the pre-DevOps, where it was like, throw it over the wall, it's your problem now. So when you don't own it, you're doing that, like, oh, I am just a feature team. SRE is going to be on call for this. They're going to have to deal with getting paged in the middle of the night. When instead it could be a little bit different. Like, that team is going to make sure they do a good job so that they don't get paged in the middle of the night. Like, that accountability is there for you to actually want to make something better. And then I still 100% believe that there should be some more subject matter experts, SRE, within an organization to strategically plan out for feature launches, for high customer traffic events, for your own traffic events, when a big outage happens, when our dependencies go down. Like, there needs to be folks that like are not like that are going to do that are not part of that feature team. So like they need to coexist.
This is going to be somewhat controversial, but I think one of the challenges for SRE in terms of what actually helping the industry is this recruitment thing where SRE roles are advertised, and it's basically a recruitment tactic, and it's just a lie basically. I've heard from quite a few people saying they've applied for SRE roles, even gone to the interviews, and they've said the right things, and then they show up and it's like, all right, now you're write these YAML configurations for this cloud thing, and that's your entire job. Like, oh, that's just so depressing to hear that that's happening in the industry.
Buzzwords make its own thing. And like, when we think about the SRE space, I would say like in the last 4 or 5 years, the amount of push that got done of like, become an SRE, you're gonna get paid $300,000 in the US. Like, that was the biggest push. So then you put that out there, then you have people trying to Google like SRE jobs. So then companies are going to be like, well, people are looking for that, I guess I'm going to have an SRE job. So I think that's part of what has caused this. And at the same time, I think some organizations are like, don't have the right leadership to have SRE. Because at the end of the day, like, a culture of reliability comes from the top. if your leadership is not able to understand reliability, understand understand reliability principles, but at the same time do it in a way that you're building it with a good culture, a blameless culture, setting a good example of hours, work time, like work-life balance, then like you're gonna be not set up for success. And then that trickles down to like a bad director, a bad engineering manager. Here comes SRE level 2, and it's just like, why do I have a pile of shit that I need to debug, or why do I need to set up 20 dashboards for these two teams?
Yeah.
I'm really passionate about this area. I think that there are organizations really need to do certain things to enable SRE to succeed, basically. And yes, it's about culture, absolutely, but it's also sort of practical things like if you're still running massive initiatives and projects with deadlines, then these are really important. Then what's going to happen? All the effort's going to be put into getting stuff over the line on time. Reliability doesn't matter. And if you fund that through capital expenditure and there's no money being put into maintaining and improving, that's the whole SRE world, is maintaining and improving. So how can you possibly succeed?
So I hear there's a word called service level objectives that helps you prioritize where your reliability should be and like goals and something like it.
Well, I've been in a situation where even defining SLOs, there's no interest, budget, or priority for that, because that is about to getting to the deadline.
I've experienced that as well, and my 2 cents on this whole thing is, like when it comes to like defining SRE teams, a lot of organizations will be like Anna said, SRE is like new and hot, therefore we need an SRE team. And then these companies find themselves in a position, as Anna said, you don't have the right leadership in place. They're just parroting something that they read somewhere from some other talking head, or they read the Google book and decide to implement it verbatim. And I think what Anna and I discovered through the course of recording season 1 of On Call Me Maybe, the biggest learning around SRE is, you got to do what feels right for your organization. And if there's anything that you're going to take from the SRE book, I would say is budget some time to invest in the reliability of your system. And that's what I think a lot of companies struggle with, whether it's in operations or in development, right? Because how many times do you hear of these like big companies that, like well-known companies that you find out are like running on Band-Aids and duct tape behind the scenes because there's this push to release new features and no one's taking the time to like fix the legacy code. I mean, it's the same thing with reliability. If you don't invest the time, if you don't have that blocked off, you don't give the space for it, how do you expect there to be improvement? So if there's any takeaway from the Google book, I would say that is it.
And I mean, then it still trickles down to management, because then you end up with the bucket of tech debt, you end up with the bucket of toil, and you end up with this part where it's like, I have all these projects that I have to do in order to make this company or services more reliable, but I've just been pulled into a 3-day incident, and then a deadline didn't get moved, and you're just burning out your team. But when you burn out your team, like, you're losing SREs, your company's SRE reputation goes down, and then you're going to be more prone to outages. So like it literally just sets them up for continuously failing.
I have this thing in my head at the moment. I'm calling it shareholder-driven development. So it's when you've got these companies who like they say we put the customer first, but they're actually just trying to get a certain profit margin, and they'll do anything to achieve that. And that's what the actual behavior ends up like. And then when you get to the point like you were saying, where you're dealing with 3-day incidents, the technical debt is so high at that point anyway. The only way to really get out of that is to just drop new stuff and just deal with that first. But that's a scary thing to do for a lot of organizations.
It needs to happen. Like, I think we need to continue pushing on the envelope on like, this is not okay. Like this is not a living condition for this industry. And yes, ICs can say it over and over again, but until leadership actually listens and starts taking action, and then it starts picking up more, it's kind of hard. I would say though that I think work-life balance for SRE, at least the conversation level, has happened more in the last 5 years than ever before. But I would say the data also shows that burnout of SREs is at an all-time high due through being like going through all of COVID. So it's kind of really hard to know what the status and temperature of the situation is.
What do you think that I never worked on call. Do you think on call is the big thing which really contributes to stress more than anything else, or is it other stuff as well?
I think it would be on call mostly because I'll say with a caveat, on call if it's mismanaged. If you're in an organization that doesn't provide psychological safety, if you're in an organization that's constantly on fire, we need to recognize the fact that yes, sometimes unexpected things happen in prod and you might go through a short period where things are blowing up, but hopefully you get things under control. And so this is a short-lived period. But when that is the default mode for your organization, I think that's when on-call becomes a 4-letter word.
I mean, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And the other part that I was going to add, that at least in my experience in some organizations that I've looked into, sadly, the SRE ends up being one of the people that has been at that organization the longest, has had the most years of experience in a certain field. So they're also getting tapped into constantly. Like, they might not be the person on call dealing with incident 1, but incident 5 post-mortem might be going on and they're needed in their room for the next 3 days. Or they have feature team X and B saying, hey, I'm having this issue. Like, that constant pinging also adds on to their workload and is something that's currently not really seen.
That is a challenge in itself, isn't it? Because I think you have senior engineers anywhere who have the majority of the information in an organization in their heads, and sort of taking that information and spreading it out in an effective way. Because you can write documentation till the cows come home, but it doesn't necessarily do the job in the right way. So it's a pretty big challenge.
So that's what you should be practicing injecting failure. Like, that's that concept of the game day, where like we are gonna run through possible failure scenarios that have happened in the industry, could happen to our technology, or things like it. And that's when you get multiple people in the room with different levels of experience, and that subject matter expert, that leader, is able to give them those thoughts, but it's not just give them in a documentation way. Is like they're actually going to have to practice it. They're going to have to do that failover. They're going to have to go figure out that they didn't instrument their code properly. They're going to go realize that their logs like maxed out, like the disk space ran out and they don't have logs for the last week and no one got paged. Like, you don't learn until you get burned, and that costs a lot. So like, learn in a different space. And
more game days. I agree.
Yeah, I love that. Now, do you find companies, like, do you know of many companies that practice having game days? Like, because I know you've given like talks on the subject. Is that a common thing? Or is it still something that's emerging in our industry?
I feel like I would say that it's still emerging. I got a chance to be a lot closer to it when we helped our customers run game days. Like, we would go on site with them or offer them the resources on how to do it. From what I've gathered, I do think that it continues happening, but from what I continue hearing is that it's not a priority because so much fire is happening. And I think it goes back to that. So much fire is happening because there's not really a proper reliability goal set up in place. And I do think that there is that aspect where systems are on fire more due to like digital demand in COVID era. So I feel like if the last 3.5 years did not happen, we would have seen that happen more. But instead, we had other things take priority, that game days are a lower priority. I do have it on my wish list for 2023 SRE mindset of like, you saw what the last years have done to your team, like actually try to get ahead of that curve. But I would say that there is a lot of companies out there that are talking about it. Everyone kind of calls it differently too. So it's kind of hard to be able to like Google or Twitter search or Mastodon search of like who's doing this. But I've heard from a lot of teams that they're like, we do tabletop exercises, or we're using open source technologies, or we're literally just deleting instances of EC2. We're deleting pods off like Kubernetes and containers, and like from looking at it on the open source space, like just seeing like the growth of chaos engineering tooling on its own kind of does shed a light that people are interested in having full control on the failure that they're going to inject into your systems, which says that they realize that they need to inject failure because things keep going wrong.
Okay, so I don't know what you both think, but I think that SRE is an impossibly wide set of knowledge and skills and experience. It's just huge, right? You could be anything. And it just seems to grow all the time. And you hear, now you're also responsible for security as well. It's like, well, what? Security is a massive field, you know? So I'd like to see like an acknowledgement that the cognitive load for being the unicorn SRE is massive. And there might be super brainiacs who can be that. But for many people, I think that there are, as Sebastian Feet says, there's like pillars of SRE, and you're going to specialize in a small enough area that you can actually master it. You know, maybe it's observability, maybe it's incident management, maybe it's, you know, automation and simplification, you know, reducing toil, that kind of thing. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I generally agree with that sentiment, although I would say that I do disagree with there being an SRE specializing in observability, because I feel like observability is the thing that spans across all SRE disciplines. But I do agree that having someone specialize in certain areas of SRE would be beneficial, because there's so much breadth right now, especially as our systems get more and more complex.
And I was going to say, I think a lot of the answer to that question, it depends on the size of the company. Like, I do think that verticals make sense when your organization is so large, like having someone that actually embodies observability principles and is able to help everyone instrument, like be that helper, could actually help expedite more teams like owning their own like observability. But at the same time, like every SRE needs to know observability, like that I wouldn't take away from. Like that is just kind of like a built-in guide of SRE, like understand your system in order to make it more reliable. But I like, apart from like big organizations having certain verticals, like be specific to like a cloud, or like this is like our customer SRE team and things like it, it's kind of different. But I do also think that your comment makes a lot of sense of like, we need to address the cognitive load that comes with SRE.
I suppose that the other side of it is that if you work for a small organization, like it's just a startup, maybe the technology landscape probably isn't as complex, so you can probably hold more of that responsibility in your head without having a stroke.
Yeah, you have a smaller code base, a smaller like customers, like less incidents, less demand, but it comes with it.
What else is on your SRE wish list? What would you like to see happen in the industry, or change or improve?
For me, I think, SRE is all about, partly about improving reliability through repeatability, right? Like not having to do a bunch of things manually is part of the job. And I think so we accomplished that already with a lot of these tools like Terraform and various other like IAC tools and whatnot. And there's even like SLOs as code with OpenSLO. At least that's the direction that things are going towards. But what I would like to see is a more complete SRE workflow. So a way to have like the SRE job codified end to end as much as possible. Because we often find ourselves in positions where you go to one company, you develop a certain way of doing things. And then you go to another company, it's like, oh yeah, I did something similar at company X and I really want to bring that over to company Y. And now you're like reinventing the wheel. So I think it'd be really cool to be able to share SRE workflows across the board, as long as they're not like proprietary, just to make our jobs easier so that then we can take some of that burden away and focus on other like innovations around improving reliability. That's one thing I would like to see.
I think with Adriana's point, I think she's like nailing it in terms of like giving those guidelines to someone else to run. Like, why do you constantly need to start from scratch when it's been started from scratch 1,150 times? And I think that's where like the open source space comes in.
It also sounds like it's making me think that of an opportunity for SREs from different organizations to also share and collaborate more to sort of leverage the common things that happen across all organizations and identify those things.
Yeah, I think for me, like the it also ties into like what Adriana was saying, is kind of like you need to codify as much as you can in order to be able to like be set up for success in terms of reliability. But a lot of it would be that you have a reliability goal in mind as you're also doing the codifying it, because if you don't have something that you can know that you're making progress towards, you don't really know if the work that you're doing is actually working. And like also making sure that you have time within the cycle of your organization to take a moment to pause and learn from what has happened, make changes as is needed, embrace failure, inject failure, and like just kind of like remember that you need to do like what's working for your team. Like if it's working and a whole new SRE book comes out, why should you run to the new SRE book and go implement that?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Before I wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Just to drive a point home that we touched on before, I would love to see more love for SLOs for 2023. I think we're getting there, but I think we still have a ways to go.
And throw some love at the humans behind those screens too.
Yes, hug ups. That's right. Remember that there are humans trying to keep your systems up and running, that even if they hiccup, there's probably someone or a team of someone's frantically trying to make sure that your user experience isn't total crap. So make sure you send them lots of love.
They're just people, they've got dogs to walk and
exactly. Babies to take care of, plants to water.
They have a whole body, a complex system in order to keep running, in order to then keep this computer system up and running. Like, it's complex.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Adriana and Anna, for our conversation about SRE in the future and our wishes. And that's all from another episode of Slight Reliability. And I will see you all next week.